November 1963, William Bruce Pitzer was head of the audio-visual unit at Bethesda Naval Hospital. A close colleague at the time was a young petty officer, Dennis David.
3 or 4 days after the assassination, I walked in his office and I saw he was working on some film. He had a movie editor, one of those reel-to-reel, and runs across the screen. And he showed it to me, and it was a 16-millimeter film of the autopsy. There were also some slides. He had some slides that he had that showed tissue slides, and also showed some slides of President Kennedy that were taken while he was on the table at the morgue. And we looked at him, kind of horrified, I guess you would say, at the seriousness of the wound. But I remember one of the things that I remembered was that we saw they had a picture of Kennedy laying on the table, and it was a front profile, if you will, or front view. And the only thing we saw was a little hole about here in the temple, and then and another photograph or another slide that Bill had showed a huge gaping hole here in the back. And so Bill and I logically assumed that the wound was a frontal entry wound, as opposed to what the Warren Commission later said being shot from behind.
For most of us, the idea that President John Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy seems about as sad and horrible as it can get. Truthfully, however, the reality gets much worse when we stop to really consider who the conspirators were and the extent that these murderers went to cover up their crime, including murdering again and again to make sure they were not brought to justice. The murder of President John Kennedy was an act of conspiracy. It was the result of cowardly and traitorous right-wing CIA and Secret Service officials, led by the acquiescence and possible planning of the CIA's Allen Dulles and the Secret Service's James J. Rowley. For Dulles and his cohorts, Richard Bissell and Charles Cabell, it was the continuation of shaping a world to fit their own greed and avarice in the name of stopping communism. Dulles and his corporate partners caused the overthrow of democracies in Iran, Guatemala, the Congo, and more, where democratically elected leaders tried to pull back ownership of their country's natural resources for the benefit of their own citizens. Tens of thousands of deaths are on the hands of Dulles and his CIA. Secret Service Chief James Rowley purposely hid all traces of the attempt on Kennedy's life in Chicago 3 weeks before Dallas. He was also a key player in ensuring the medical evidence cover-up at Bethesda the night of the assassination. With conspirators this high in government office, they were able to do almost anything to ensure no actual investigation into the assassination would occur. Dulles practically begged to be on the Warren Commission, where he became the de facto leader of that body, ensuring its ineptitude. One of the real worries of the men covering up their coup d'etat was a naval commander named Dr. William Pitzer. Commander Pitzer was head of the Educational Television Department at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Washington, and he was present during at least the X-ray portion of the autopsy, taking 16mm motion pictures of the autopsy procedures and the people who were directing it. There was also a closed-circuit television recording system in place at Bethesda that Dr. Pitzer would have had access to. Not many were even aware that night that that system existed. While the conspirators were able to control and direct the autopsy step by step to eliminate all real medical investigation into the murder, Dr. Pitzer's filming could not be manipulated so easily.
My job in working with autopsies was to remove the brain.
What struck me was when we removed the sheet, I looked down, I said, my God, he didn't have any brains left, literally. I was just astounded by it. I think everybody else was too, because there was just a gasp throughout the room. There was no brain to be removed at all.
The Assassination Records Review Board, created out of a broad public conviction that the government was hiding important information, started in 1996 and finished its work on September 30th, 1998. The board collected and released thousands of previously secret government records about President John F. Kennedy's murder. Gerald Custer gave testimony to the ARRB. The first thing Custer noticed when getting ready to begin the X-ray process was that there was an apparatus inside of Kennedy's head, either metal or plastic. Custer was told by the duty officer and another official that Kennedy's body had gone to Walter Reed Compound before coming to Bethesda. Before the night was over, Custer would be sworn to secrecy multiple times, forced to sign secrecy documents, and threatened with imprisonment or worse should he ever reveal the details of the autopsy. Custer's testimony shortly thereafter reveals that Commander William Pitzer was there taking movies and refusing to be admonished by others around him who did not like his taking film of the proceedings. Custer's own words regarding Commander Pitzer: he just kept right on going, saying, "I'm doing my job." Custer took series after series of x-rays, with each series being rushed away to be reviewed by people including Secret Service Director James Rowley, to make sure the resulting x-ray pictures adhered to the lie of the lone shooter. Dr. Pitzer's presence had not been anticipated by the conspirators, and he was taking footage that could not be as easily controlled. That footage, along with other still photos that Dr. Pitzer was in ownership of, clearly showed a small front bullet wound and the massive grapefruit-sized gaping wound in the back of Kennedy's head. Exactly what the Dallas doctors saw and reported. Here is where it really gets strange. White House official photographer Bob Knudsen was called on the day of the assassination and told to meet the arriving plane at Andrews Air Force Base. He was then gone for 3 days. He would report that he photographed the president's autopsy, but he was not at Bethesda that evening. Knudsen states that he was sworn to secrecy, but it appears that he was tasked with photographing a fake autopsy so that pictures could be forged with the president's actual photographic content. In his obituary, the Washington Post and the New York Times both referred to Knudsen's autopsy experiences. In the 70s, Knudsen was summoned to testify before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which was reinvestigating the Kennedy assassination. During his testimony, he was shown autopsy photos that are in the official autopsy record. According to his wife and children, Knudsen returned home and indicated that the autopsy photos he had been shown during his testimony were fraudulent.
Knudsen came to me and he said, Joe, I have something I want to show you. So I went back to his sort of a workroom, and he pulled out an envelope and showed me about 12 pictures, 5 by 7, and had all these pictures of the president on his stomach and on his back, and could see the hole here, about 3/8 of an inch, and the back of his head above the line, big hole about the size of a grapefruit. And then a couple days later, maybe a day later, he said, Joe, have a minute? And I said, sure. He said, I want to show you something. Those pictures I showed you the other day, these are the same ones, but a little different. And I said, what do you mean? He said, let me show you. He got the first one out, and I said, no hole. He said, no, they covered it up. And looked in the back, the hole was neatly covered up. And I said, "Who did that?" He said, "Well, I didn't do it." I said, "Well, I'm not saying you did, but I'm surprised."
There is no record of Robert Knudsen attending Kennedy's autopsy, yet he had photographs in his possession that had clearly been altered.
Another example of fake photos was provided by Sandra Spencer, the petty officer in charge of the White House Photo Laboratory. The day after the assassination, her boss, Robert Knudsen, notified her that a Secret Service agent named James Fox would be bringing film negatives to be developed. Spencer developed the films and discovered there were color photos of Kennedy's corpse. Fox told her to forget that he had been there. Spencer testified before the Assassination Records Review Board in 1997, providing assurance the photos she developed for Secret Service agent Fox were not taken at the official autopsy, even being a different type of film used. So now we have nearly indisputable proof that fake autopsy pictures were taken to falsify President Kennedy's real wounds, especially the front headshot from the grassy knoll that blew out much of the rear portion of his skull. X-ray technician Gerald Custer and White House photographer Bob Knudsen were already sworn to secrecy and made to understand the severity of the consequences of breaking that silence. But Commander William Pitzer was an unknown to the conspirators. They probably were unsure of exactly what photographic evidence he possessed, and they almost certainly did not know about the closed-circuit footage that Pitzer had taken. As time went on, it appears that several people knew Pitzer had footage that would show the real position and extent of Kennedy's wounds. Further, after 28 years, Pitzer was getting ready to retire and was reportedly working on a project about the assassination that had already received interest from several television networks. It was now that the conspirators struck once again to protect their coup d'etat and themselves from being exposed for assassinating President Kennedy.
Lieutenant Colonel Dan Marvin has spent his life serving his country. A veteran of 8 combat campaigns, he earned 21 awards and decorations. 15 years a paratrooper, he served in the elite special forces, the Green Berets. Just a few weeks after the assassination, he volunteered for specialist guerrilla training at Fort Bragg.
Almost all of the instruction in the guerrilla warfare school was classified. The most secret was the top secret training on assassinations and terrorism. And at that time we went to a different building that had a double barbed wire fence around it and guard dogs in it. On the John F. Kennedy situation, that was brought to our attention as a classic example of the way to organize a complete program to eliminate a nation's leader while pointing the finger at a lone assassin. It involved also the cover-up of the assassination itself. They told us that Oswald was not involved in the shooting at all. He was the patsy. He was the one that was set up.
At Fort Bragg, 15 months after his training, Dan was summoned to meet an official from the CIA, a company man. David Vanek, a fellow officer in assassination training, also attended.
First, the company man took me aside and showed me his badge, his ID card, and he asked me if I would volunteer to kill a man, a United States citizen, a naval officer. Didn't tell me who it was at first. Now, I assumed what he was talking about was killing a man overseas. He asked me at first if I would accept an assignment to kill somebody. He didn't give me the name, but then I asked for the name, assuming it would be, like I said, overseas. And he gave me the name, William Bruce Pitzer. Hard name to forget, really, once you hear it. And so I told him yes. And then he said, we have to, he started to lay out the details of it. And the details included the fact that I would have to get him before he retired. And he retired in a very short period of time, if I remember correctly, and he was stationed at Bethesda Naval Hospital, so I'd have to actually get him here in the United States. Well, I refused. because that wasn't the way that we were trained that this was going to happen. We were supposed to be used as their assets, the CIA's assets, for use in assassinations overseas. In the United States, the mafia was supposed to supply what resources they need for killing somebody here in the United States. So he then asked David Vanek. He went over to David Vanek and talked to him. Now, I don't know what he talked to David Vanek about. He might ask him the price of ice cream. I don't know. But I never saw David Vanek after that day.
Lieutenant Commander William B. Pitzer was found dead at the Naval Medical School, Bethesda, on October 29, 1966. First ruled a suicide, FBI files on the investigation released in 1997 revealed that there was a strong possibility that Pitzer had been murdered. The paraffin tests of Pitzer's right palm and back of hand were negative, indicating the absence of nitrate, therefore no exposure to gunpowder. FBI tests indicated that the revolver must have been held at a distance of more than 3 feet when discharged.
Dennis left Bethesda for a new posting, but in November 1966, a colleague gave him some distressing news regarding his old friend Bill Pitzer. He'd been found dead in a pool of blood in his studio at Bethesda. The official verdict was suicide. Lying face down on the floor, a .38 revolver by his side, he had a bullet wound in the right temple.
When the occupational therapist had told me this, I remember I reminded said, that doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense because Bill was left-handed, and because we used to kid him all the time when playing bridge about being a southpaw, because sometimes he'd deal in reverse instead of dealing them in the correct sequence. He'd deal them in the opposite way, and we kind of harass him about it.
There are grave doubts about Pitzer's alleged suicide. His left hand had been so mangled, as if tortured, that his wedding ring could not be removed and given to his widow.
Bill had told me shortly before he left Bethesda, which was around the 7th of December of '65, he told me that he was planning on retiring because he had enough time in and he was wanting to get out, and that he also said he had some damn lucrative offers from some TV networks, and other people have asked me why I think he was assassinated, and I think it was because that with him retiring, they, and I don't know who they are, were afraid that he would take these pictures that he and I had seen, this 35 millimeter and the 16 millimeter film, that he would take them, and that if he went to work for a major studio, that they would use them, or he would have them aired, and that would really, blow some people out of the water if that would have transpired. I could be wrong, I could be all wet, but I do know those films exist because I was there, I saw the damn things.
I am absolutely certain that the name that I was given underneath those pine trees in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the first week of August was William Bruce Pitzer. I put it completely out of my mind from 1965 until 1993. And I was watching a special in November '93 about the assassination of Kennedy. I think it was a special by Jack Anderson. And at the end of that special, on the television, they rolled a list of 42 names of people who had met a violent death that were somehow associated with the assassination or the cover-up or the autopsy or something. And I was sitting there in my living room watching that, and the name William Bruce Pitzer came over the screen. And it made me go right back to that day in August of 1965. That was the William Bruce Pitzer that I was asked to kill, unless there's two William Bruce Pitzers that worked at Bethesda Naval Hospital. That man, the name of the other Green Beret that was approached by the CIA agent in August of 1965 at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, was David H. Vanek, captain, who went through the same training I did, same class I was in. And I have tried, ever since I saw the name William Bruce Pitzer come out on that screen, I've tried to find him. And I've been totally unsuccessful. I sent letters to the special office and the Retired Services Directorate, where they'll take a letter that you send them with a man's name and serial number, and they'll forward it to him. Or if he's deceased, they'll send it back to you. I got no response from them, so I finally sent another follow-up letter and demanded a response, or I threatened to go to Senator D'Amato to help me on the response. And then I did get a response, but the response was that David H. Vanek never existed in the United States Army.
But Dan still has published Army orders proving that Captain David H. Vanek was with him at the Special Warfare Center.
Recognizing just what kind of a person I was, and which I am hopefully no longer. It is not an easy thing to do. It would be easier for me to just melt into the woodwork and let my family, especially my grandchildren, think of me as kind of the friendly old giant that helps them do things and plays with them, rather than what I've done in the past. And I know that when this, if it is made public, the information that I've given will adversely affect my relations with my family. And I just hope and pray that our love survives it. And I hope and pray that it does some good for this nation.